All right. Hi, everyone. So today I'll have the privilege of introducing you to yet another terrifying consequence of climate change through my research on groundwater surface water interactions in Colorado's Manitou experimental forest. So first of all, it's pretty easy to see why we care so much about water in our everyday lives. But why do we care about groundwater specifically in the first place? So you can probably assume that it has something to do with these climate change graphs that we're looking at right now. So this graph predicts how snowfall, groundwater, and streamflow levels will change in a typical year in the Western US due to the influence of climate change. These solid lines are current levels, and these dashed lines are predictions. And what this tells us is that reduced snowfall has massive impacts on groundwater resources, and that's about 35% of the fresh water that people use worldwide. Given that precipitation, such as snow, directly contributes to the amount of surface water that flows into groundwater that we use, it's vital for us to characterize the boundary between groundwater and surface water so that we can know how one of our most important resources for everyday life will be affected in the future. So how exactly do we go about doing that? Well, we have to ask ourselves two important questions. First off, how old is the groundwater? And to know that, we can use chemical tracers in the water to calculate a quantity called groundwater residence time, which describes how many years on average that a sample of water has been within the subsurface. And this is really important because if we want to use a resource, we need to know where it's actually being replenished. And places with the youngest groundwater point to those infiltration sites. The other question that we really want to address is what controls the connection between groundwater and surface water? There's a lot of complex factors that can contribute, but one main factor is a quantity called hydraulic conductivity, which basically describes how easily water can flow through a given material. For example, if you have really small grains of soil, like silt, you're going to have less space between those rock grains, and so that makes it difficult for water to flow through. But if you have really large rock grains like gravel, there's lots of space for water to move between, and you get a higher hydraulic conductivity. With the smaller rock grains, you've had a lower hydraulic conductivity because it's harder for water to flow through. The other factor that has a major influence on the groundwater surface water interface is the local slope in an area. If gravity is working in your favor with a higher and steeper slope, it changes how easily groundwater can move in the subsurface, which ultimately influences the residence time. So given all of that information, the hypothesis that we wanted to test in particular was whether we could find younger groundwater in areas that are steeper with high hydraulic conductivity, since those conditions would theoretically make it easier for water to infiltrate into the subsurface. And so to investigate that hypothesis with experimental data, we looked at the Hotel Gulch watershed, which is a stream within Colorado's Manitou experimental forest. At 8 sites throughout the watershed, this is site 1 and that's site 8, we collected groundwater samples through wells like these. An analysis of those samples allowed us to determine the mean residence time of the groundwater. We also measured the temperature of the water with temperature sensors attached to wooden stakes like this, which measured the water temperature at the stream bed and at varying depths below that. That temperature data could then be put into a heat flow equation, which allowed us to model values for hydraulic conductivity at each site. Finally, we also took an average slope within a 10-meter radius of each site's groundwater well, and we outlined that in this elevation diagram below. The areas of highest gradient are the steepest, and the areas with low elevation gradient are the flattest. So when we pull all of that data together, what do we actually find? On the left is a plot of the best fit groundwater residence time versus hydraulic conductivity on a log scale. And you can see that there's a pretty clear negative correlation here. On the right, there's another plot of residence time, but this time against the average slope in each site. And once again, we're seeing that negative correlation. And so these results confirm our initial hypothesis. We do actually see younger groundwater in areas with higher hydraulic conductivity and steeper slopes. And the significance of that result goes back to the climate change graphs that we were looking at earlier and how groundwater levels are predicted to drop over time. Given the importance of groundwater resources to both ecosystems and human use, it's important for us to assess where groundwater and surface water are the most connected because those areas of high connection are where water resources are the most vulnerable to the changes in precipitation brought about by climate change. And environmental factors such as hydraulic conductivity and slope can help us to find those places. That's all I have for you. Thank you so much for listening.
Yay, fantastic job. Floor is now open for questions. So if you have one, you can type it in the chat or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. Ooh, okay. Sorry, my eyes got really fuzzy. That was weird. Is there anything that you would do differently if you were starting this all over from scratch? If you started your project today with the knowledge that you had, but not the results, is there anything that you would do differently?
Yeah, in terms of things I would do differently, I think maybe read up on the modeling a little bit more. That was definitely the most time-intensive part of this project, was the hydraulic conductivity modeling, because basically you put a bunch of parameters into the program with the temperature data, and then you keep running it over and over again until you get a good fit for the temperature curves that you're seeing to find the values of hydraulic conductivity. So yeah, I feel like I would have investigate that a little bit more, because I spent a lot of time troubleshooting in the beginning parts of it, but yeah.
Okay. Heather has a question. What was the most interesting or challenging part of the project for you?
Yeah, so I feel like I kind of just explained the most challenging part with the modeling. Definitely, it was a bit of a struggle at first, but once you get a handle on it, it's way more manageable. But I think the most interesting part is that I'm not really a hydrologist by training. I'm an astrobiology major, actually. So the most interesting part of the whole thing was experiencing a new field. Never knew that there was this much to know about water, but here we are. And I feel like I have a lot more of a broader knowledge now than I did starting out, even just a few months ago. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do you think other perturbations in the forest, like wildfires or landslides, would affect the trends?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, things like wildfires and things will affect like the soil underlying them, obviously. And so, the water flowing through that is going to have a lot of changes in how easily it can go through, depending on what's happened in the area. So yeah, definitely environmental factors like that can really change what we're seeing in terms of the data.
Thanks.